Hello everyone, welcome to the Logical Fallacy, and welcome to another special reaction for you guys. Today we have FNAF releasing a new theory today. The biggest FNAF debate is about to end. I think we can all see where this is going based on the thumbnail. It, it very much appears this is going to be diving into the secret of the mimic, potential storylines, and most importantly, is it going to connect to the books? So I'm really excited about this. So I'm going to be pausing a lot, talking about just my opinions about the books, about all of that as we go through whatever is relevant. Let's stop talking and let's check out this theory.
Throughout the history of FNAF, there's been many different debates, with one of the most popular being
Was that the bite of 87?
the bite of 87 versus 83 debate. This debate got super ugly, and people argued for months about this, until Scott decided to step in and clarify things in the next game, officially deeming this the bite of 83. It's been nearly a decade since that debate occurred, and I regret to inform you that history is repeating itself. A portion of the community has been on fire for the past year and a half, and just like in 2015, we're about to get a game that might just clear it all up. That game is The Secret of the Mimic.
But, I mean, didn't we already get that, though? I mean, Into the Pit. We had a entire game that was dedicated to retelling the first story. And that was like an official entry into the franchise. I think, and Scott's already clarified this, by the way. I think this is something that a lot of people miss, and it happened all the way back, I believe, in like 2019. Yeah, it was 2019 because it was after the release of Help Wanted, whenever the books were just coming out. So this was, that would have been like 2020, in between the release of Security Breach and like FNAF AR and stuff. There was a Reddit thread that talked about retcons, where the story was going. Was there an actual story to all of this? And Scott was like, yes, there is. And one thing that he specifically said is the games are going to look forward while the books are going to be filling in gaps of the past. I think we were a bit confused on what parts of the past it was actually going to be filling in, because it primarily focused on between the time periods of Ultimate Custom Night and 2 Help Wanted. So it kind of filled in the gaps between what we were seeing, why we were seeing it, what happened with like the fire and stuff. Like that was really important information. And then after Security Breach came out, it wasn't exactly the story Scott had in mind as far as the way that Steel Wool, and that was completely a communication issue with Scott, not telling Steel Wool what he actually wanted from the story. But Tales of the Pizzaplex was the solution to that. And it added more world building and added more of the history. We even got some of that with like VIP and stuff, with like explaining what happened within like the 5 years that we know the Pizzaplex was open. GGY, things like that. So Scott's already clarified this down, everything. Even after the release of Ruin, we got some clarification for why specific design choices were chosen for the Mimic, like with the fabric on the head. That was actually explained in the epilogues, and the very last one with with B7 Part 2, that book, with the story, with the epilogues of that book. So yeah, we already really have this confirmation, but I do understand with like the whole Edwin, is Edwin in the story? Is this actually, or is it like a stand-in situation where it's actually someone else? Is it Henry? You know, I don't personally think it is, but we'll see where this goes. Sorry, I just had to put that in there.
Explain. Back in December of 2021, after years of waiting, we finally got Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach. This was the biggest FNAF game we've ever gotten, and with it came a bunch of new lore. That lore, though, was quickly proven to be borderline impossible to solve. Back in 2022, I came to the conclusion that it felt like Security Breach was trying to tell two versions of a story. And nearly 3 years after the game's release, Scott revealed that this actually was the case.
I had a very specific story in mind, and it is very different than the one that got in the game. And I think a part of that is the way that I conveyed that to Steel Wool. I was trying to tell Steel Wool to put specific items in specific places, have specific characters do certain things, meanwhile not telling them what the story plot was. That didn't work out very well because they got all of these pieces and they thought it was their job to connect them in a way that made sense. And so really what you ended up having were the same pieces, but telling completely different stories.
Scott only gave Steel Wool pieces of the story he was trying to tell. Because of this, Security Breach contained two different stories. Steel Wool's story and the pieces of Scott's story left throughout the game. About a year after the game came out, these pieces that Scott gave to Steel Wool actually started revealing themselves with the release of the Tales from the Pizzaplex books.
Yep.
The first piece was revealed in March of 2023 when the fifth Tales from the Pizzaplex book came out. In this book, we got a story called GGY, where Gregory was revealed to be a very skilled hacker who was able to give himself an absurdly high score on the arcade machines throughout the Pizzaplex. And little did we know in the games, on the arcade machines throughout the Pizzaplex, you can see GGY at the top of the leaderboards.
Yep.
It was this
Really
story
cool.
that really made it clear that Scott was using these books to point us in the right direction. And a huge thing that those books introduced us to was the Mimic. In the Tales books, we literally got a whole story outlining the origins of the Mimic, including who built it, where it was built, and why it was built. The books gave us all of this stuff before Ruin even came out and revealed the Mimic as the big twist villain. The Mimic first being introduced in the books and then being put into the games really made the debate heat up. That debate being, does 100% of what happens in the Tales books also happen in the games? Does the Mimic have the exact same backstory in the games as it does in the books? Let's talk about it. The biggest question for me that will hopefully be answered in Secret of the Mimic is who actually built the Mimic in the games? Well, I believe there are 4 possible ways it could go.
Well, before it gets to that, one thing to note, it might not actually answer any of those questions because of the way that the books talk about the history of the Mimic. There was a period where Fazbear Entertainment specifically took initiative with the Mimic program and built their own line, their own Mimic line, right? Something went wrong and they deactivated them. That was like, or like wanted to, right? And so, but there's not a whole lot of context exactly about what that included, because a lot of that story happens early on the timeline. This game is set in 1979, so it's like, this is a period of time where it's like Fredbear's Family Diner, Freddy's isn't a thing yet, and yet there's a lot of things being prepared for that, well before it even opened. So there's a lot of questions about the origins of things. I feel like there's a way that Scott could specifically make it vague enough to where that debate still could continue. But
Could either be Edwin, the man who built the Mimic in the books, Henry, William Afton, or finally some new character that Scott and Steel Wool came up with. Unless something extreme.
And with that note, it could be both, because we don't know who was the one who had the journal in the epilogues, who was talking about the Mimic. And that was found in the FNAF 6 location. It is very possible Henry built the new line of Mimic Endos, or potentially even Afton. We know that the Fun Times were designed with mimicking abilities, so it is possible that that program was used in a way. There's some hints in the books about that, specifically with a through line that I think is very interesting, but we'll leave that there.
extremely unexpected happens, I think these are the only 4 possible options. Why? Well, let's start with Henry. If you've watched any of my theories from the past year and a half, you know that I've believed that Henry is the one who built the Mimic in the games. A big reason for this was because the Mimic's story in the books is very similar to Henry's story in the Silver Eyes trilogy. A dad who builds a robot that mimics his kid. After his kid dies, the dad beats up the robot in a fit of grief and rage. After beating up the robot then becomes the main antagonist of the whole series. After doing more research though, I found that the connections don't stop there. Let's look at the context of how we find the Mimic in Ruin. After shutting down all of the Bonnie-shaped security nodes, Cassie enters the area where the Mimic is being hidden. This area consists of a cave with glowing mushrooms, a waterfall, and a room with carnival-themed mascot costumes. After shutting down mexes and freeing the Mimic, Gregory reveals that the Mimic has been trapped down there for, quote, a really long time.
I don't know what it is, but it's been trapped down here a really long time.
This means that a very long time ago, someone captured the Mimic and wanted to keep it hidden underground, going as far as to build mexes to help keep it from escaping. Now let me point you towards what happens in the Silver Eyes trilogy. In the last book, it's revealed that Henry was able to capture the robot he built and keep it hidden underground.
Yep.
This area where he kept the robot hidden consisted of a cave with glowing mushrooms, a waterfall, and a room with carnival-themed mascot costumes. This is literally exactly what we see in...
Also interesting to note, underneath his house, just like sister location, right? It's the books feel very much like parallels or alternate versions of the characters, where in this case Henry has some attributes of Afton's actual story, where, you know, we know that Afton underneath his house built sister location as a way of keeping baby, you know, safe underneath there. We also know it was a experiment before that, or maybe potentially after that. That's a little bit fuzzy on exactly the timeline of that.
Ruin. I think these connections are valid to make, but even with all of these connections, you could make a very valid rebuttal. Just because the Tales books in Ruin are telling a similar story to Henry in the Silver Eyes doesn't mean Henry has to assume the same role in both. A different character could have easily built the Mimic in the games and just had a very similar storyline to Henry's. I think that's an extremely valid rebuttal. But here's why I think Henry building the Mimic would make logical and narrative sense. When Steelwool and Scott were making Ruin, they were faced with a choice. They knew the Mimic was going to be the big reveal at the end, but the choice lies in where they wanted the Mimic to be found. They could have put the Mimic anywhere, but they ultimately decided to put the Mimic under the FNAF 6 pizzeria. And when we visit this pizzeria in Security Breach, we get to see the actual labyrinth that Henry used to burn all of the animatronics in FNAF 6. Where we find the Mimic, though, is directly under this labyrinth. Not only that, the door we go through to get to the Mimic is literally inside Henry's labyrinth. Judging by the extremely old and worn away staircase, it doesn't look like this door was a new addition either. This staircase is old, and it turns out that Mex's is old too. A lot of people have speculated that Gregory and Vanessa must have built the Mex's machine after the events of Security Breach, but recently we got new information that might have disproved that theory. In my interview with J-Top from Steelwool Studios, he revealed that the Mex's machine was specifically designed to look old, and that it's not a new machine.
That is deliberately supposed to be an older machine. So
Okay.
the Whopper being like a good example of like, hey, here's a supercomputer.
But it's old.
Before computers are like this.
Yeah.
The model just is not a modern computer.
No, it's not. It's
Right.
very old.
It looks old.
The Mex's machine was specifically designed to look like an old supercomputer from the early 80s. And if it really was made all the way back then, Gregory and Vanessa couldn't have been the ones to build it. It must have been someone from decades ago who knew about the Mimic and deliberately wanted to keep it hidden. And judging by the location of the door to get to Mex's, I think the person who built it and wanted to keep the Mimic hidden all those years ago was Henry. This to me makes somewhat logical sense. But how can it...
Unless we go with the idea that underneath FNAF 6 is actually sister location, which just saying there is an incredible amount of information in the games that really hint at the FNAF 6 location being Fredbear's Family Diner, and thus being leading to the facility. And so the idea that this is actually Afton's creation, because it also has the scooper in that area as well. And so we have that paired together, and it feels like the entire ending of Ruin felt like very similar to Sister Location, right? We're being led through the corridors, being told where to go by Gregory. It feels purposefully reminiscent, right? And it's also interesting, the comparison to the movie, the Whopper Machine movie, the oh my goodness, War Games, that's what it's called. But in that movie, it's literally about a kid who thinks he's playing a game, but he's really actually accidentally hacked into a military supercomputer that's programmed to launch nuclear weapons without human contact, as a way of basically like being the decisive vote on whether or not there should be like that mutual destruction, where, you know, if it was deemed necessary, they would like release the nuke. So that was like a strategic machine designed to do something that would like result in destruction, but someone thinks they're playing a different game with it, but in reality they're not. But at the end, the way to defeat it was actually basically playing a game of tic-tac-toe, showing that basically war is unwinnable at its core. And so they ended up at the end just playing a game of chess. That was the end, apparently. I've not watched the movie. I just read about it, studying for. So that's really interesting. That's a really interesting comparison, if that is what they're going for with Mexis.
Make narrative sense. If Henry really did build mexes and kept the Mimic hidden underground for all of this time, why is this the first time we're hearing about it? And how is Mexes, a machine built in the early 80s, so connected to the Pizzaplex, which was built way in the future? Well, if Mexes really was built in the early 80s, someone in the modern day must have actively connected Mexes to the Pizzaplex. We know that Henry dies way before the Pizzaplex is even built, so someone at the Pizzaplex must have taken on the mantle of keeping the Mimic buried underground. And this may be hard to believe, but this is exactly what happens in the Silver Eyes trilogy. In the Silver Eyes trilogy, Henry ends up taking his own life because of the overwhelming grief of losing his daughter. But before he does, he leaves a note behind for his sister Jenny. In this note, he tells her about the robot he built and how he was able to capture it and keep it hidden underground, in what he deems as the fourth closet. Quote, "My only lasting instruction for you concerns the fourth closet. It is not enough to keep it shut. You must keep that one sealed and buried. I was able to seal it away, and you, Jenny, must ensure that the seal remains." Henry passed the torch to someone else, now having them make sure that what he hid underground stays hidden. And I think this also could have happened in the games. The reason Mexes, a machine from the early 80s, is linked directly to the modern day Pizzaplex is because someone carried on the duties of making sure the Mimic stayed hidden after Henry died in FNAF 6. And I think we know who this person is. We know it has to be someone who has access to a Vanny mask so they can set up the security nodes throughout the mall. Someone who's a technician or is smart enough to know how to use Mexes and set up the nodes. And we know it has to be someone who would do anything to make sure the Mimic stays hidden. If you haven't picked up on it already, all signs are pointing to this person being Cassie's dad. If Cassie's dad was the one trusted to continue keeping the Mimic hidden, suddenly everything starts making sense. Cassie's dad is a Fazbear technician and would be smart enough to know how to use Mexes.
It's just like my dad's.
Cassie's dad also has access to a Vanny mask, something that surprised all of us in Help Wanted 2. This would also explain why the security nodes and Mexes resemble Bonnie. Bonnie was Cassie's dad's favorite character. But if you aren't convinced that Cassie's dad is the one who set up the Mexes security nodes yet, here's the ultimate need more proof. In Ruin, Ruin, there's only one security node that's not like the rest. Roxy, the final security node.
Yep.
When the trailer for Ruin came out, we were all confused because Roxy looked different, almost like she was wearing a mask. And in Ruin, we used that mask to deactivate the final node, Roxy. Then, in Help Wanted 2, we learned that the mask didn't just magically appear on Roxy, someone put it there. That someone is Cassie's dad, the person we play as in Help Wanted 2. Cassie's dad put that mask on Roxy, turning her into a walking security node. We also know that Cassie's dad would literally do anything to make sure the Mimic stays hidden. In Security Breach, we learned that Vanessa, under the control of the Mimic virus, used Glamrock Freddy to clear a path to where the Mimic was hiding.
She brought me here. I found myself for the first time when I cleared the path.
But in the canon ending of Security Breach, Gregory frees Vanessa from the virus. After being freed, Gregory and Vanessa both go down to re-trap the Mimic underground. This is why we can find Gregory's backpack in the Mimic's lair in Ruin, next to a vent filled with concrete. We also know that Cassie's dad catches wind of what happens and drops everything to make sure the Mimic doesn't escape. This leads us to the note we find in Ruin from Cassie's dad. Quote, "Gone for a while. Money for food on counter, emergency contacts on fridge." Making sure the Mimic doesn't escape was so important to him that he was willing to leave his daughter behind to get it done. So Cassie's dad left that note for Cassie, grabbed his Vanny mask, and went to the Pizzaplex. There, I think he took his Vanny mask and created all of the Bonnie-shaped security nodes and connected the now Bonnie-shaped mexes directly to the Pizzaplex, even locking the doors behind him to make sure no one can get to the Mimic. After making sure the physical Mimic can't escape, he makes his way to the FNAF 6 pizzeria, where he uses that same Vanny mask to destroy what's left of the Mimic virus. Need more proof? Well, I present the entire plot of Help Wanted 2. In Help Wanted 2, we see Cassie's dad, who made his way through the Pizzaplex and down to the FNAF 6 pizzeria with his Vanny mask, trying to destroy what's left of the Mimic virus. But as we learn,
No. That's the problem. It doesn't appear that that is the case, though, because we know that, or at least we can really assume that Glitchtrap is the one who brought us down there, that is controlling us, who is trying to make us stop, basically to finish what she started, to finish what Vanessa, maybe not Vanessa, started. There's a cut line specifically from the game that pretty much just like spells it out, and it's coming from Vanessa. It's coming from Vanessa, and it's an alternate line that leads you to Princess Quest. And in that dialogue, it tells us, right, that like she's trying to use you to finish. It's trying to use you to finish what she started. You know, you have to fight it. You have to take off the mask, see the world as it is. You know, it's bound to its memories. So you need to collect those memories, right, to go into. So it's leading us to the Princess Quest ending. The only issue is that the Princess Quest 4 ending isn't canon. The interview with the interview with Stillwell that John had, right, where he was talking about that ending. He asked them, does that ending destroy Glitchtrap? Is he gone? And they were like, yeah, it's smushed, gone, kaput. Yes. In that ending, that does not mean that ending is canon, right? They never said in the interview that the ending was canon. And there's a specific detail in Ruin that proves that Princess Quest 4 was never played. And that's the fact that the sword of light that you're given in Princess Quest 4 is still plunged into the third cabinet, into Princess Quest 3 in Ruin, which means that that's the last place it was put. And that room is full of fanning imagery of Glitchtrap. There's also a lot of implications with Mexis that specifically come from... We don't have to get into that, but basically there's some heavy implication that the Shadow Rabbit is actually Glitchtrap. theory for a different time. Let's get back into this. Just let that settle.
Learn in both endings of that game, Cassie's dad never makes it out of the pizzeria. This causes Cassie to then wonder where her missing father went, which then leads to the events of Ruin. Cassie is lured into the Pizzaplex by the Mimic and is tricked into undoing everything her dad set in place. A big question I had while writing this theory was, if Henry really did build the Mimic, why didn't he just burn the Mimic in FNAF 6 with everyone else? If he really wanted to end everything in FNAF 6, why not end the Mimic too? Well, I think it's because the Mimic already was burnt and it didn't work. In Help Wanted 2 and now the Secret of the Mimic trailer, we've been getting hints that there was some kind of big fire associated with the Mimic. Even the Mimic in the Tales books is described as looking extremely burnt. Someone burned this thing years ago, and yet it still lives. So since burning it didn't work, it needed to be buried and locked underground. This is why Henry didn't burn.
To specify, in the epilogues, the Mimic is not at the Pizzaplex, at least for the books. It was specifically brought in there. And I think that's what ties special delivery with everything else, because there was this theory a while back. Actually, John, I think, stated this, as well as I think Game Theory reiterated it, that the delivery that Vanessa orchestrated in special delivery through the emails was actually the Mimic. And I think that makes the most sense. I think that works. But it does bring up that question of like, okay, so the Mimic got out, where was it? There's an answer for that, but it requires some explanation, so I'm not going to get into my theory for that, but we'll just keep going. But I just wanted to clarify, like, specifically too, there were some repairs done to the Mimic beforehand, like the head, which is important because that's where like all the housing is, where like the actual Mimic program is. It was specifically new, brand new.
Burned the Mimic in FNAF 6, and instead kept it locked underground directly underneath where the FNAF 6 fire took place. As Henry says in FNAF 6,
I have to call them all back, all of them, together in one place.
It turns out everything was together in one place, except some things were buried deeper than others. When we got the title of the new game, Secret of the Mimic, I saw a lot of people have a problem with it, mostly because every title recently has had some sort of double meaning, and this one doesn't seem to have a double meaning, but I think it does. Not only does the Mimic probably inherently hold a few secrets, I think the Mimic is the secret. It's a robot that dates back to the earliest point in the timeline, and whatever happened in 1979 was so bad that it needed to be kept buried and hidden underground for decades. Not only does that make the title make more sense, but from a storytelling perspective, it's a way to explain why this thing from the earliest point in the FNAF timeline hasn't been seen or talked about until now. It's something that's too dangerous to be burned again. It needs to be buried, locked away, and never talked about again. Not only do I think this option for who built the Mimic would be very cool to see, I think it would be nice to finally learn more about such an important character that we barely hear any backstory about in the games. But there are other options. I think William Afton is also a very valid option for building the Mimic. The things going for it are that William Afton obviously has some fascination with the circus. He created Circus Baby's Pizza World, making a bunch of circus-themed funtime animatronics. His sister location bunker is filled with a bunch of weird creations, including the Ennard clown mask, which looks similar to Jackie from Secret of the Mimic. Jackie has a line going down the center of her face, which is very much Afton's style with his faceplate designs. So although personally I think this is the least likely, William Afton could very well also have built the Mimic. But here's where I may shock you. If I had to put money on it right now and commit to one of these possibilities, I wouldn't put money on Henry or William creating the Mimic in the games. I would put money on either a brand new character that Scott and Steele came up with, or Edwin from the books being the creator of the Mimic in the games. Yeah. Here's why. I think it all started with what Scott said in the newest Dawko interview. Scott only gave Steelwool pieces of the story he was trying to tell, and after Security Breach didn't go as planned, he was obviously using the Tales books to try and point us us in the right direction. In these books, Scott literally gave us an entire origin story for the Mimic, with the Mimic originally being built in an abandoned factory building. Then I went to PAX and I got to play the Secret of the Mimic demo, and it turns out the whole demo takes place in what seems to be a factory building, matching up with what we see in the books. After watching the new Scott interview and playing the demo, I wouldn't be surprised if we get the exact same origin story from the books copy and pasted into the game. I also wouldn't be surprised if Edwin from the books shows up in Secret of the Mimic as the creator of the Mimic. Does this go against literally everything I've said for the past year and a half? Yes, and I think the point of this video is to show you that that's okay. I have gotten boatloads of hate for even suggesting that the story in the games might be different from the story in the books. There's a very passionate group of people who really want me to be wrong when Secret of the Mimic comes out. And yes, it would be very nice to be proven right in Secret of the Mimic. I would actually fall out of my chair if Henry is revealed to be the one who built the Mimic. But I want you to know that I don't make these theories with the expectation that I will be proven right. I make theories because it's fun, and I treat them as almost a time capsule of what I was thinking at that time. Do I still think Baby is the Mimic? No. Do I still think Funtime Freddy used an illusion disc to make himself look like Fredbear in Midnight Motorist? No, but those theories were fun to make, and I hope you had fun watching them. Even though I may disagree with taking the story from the books and copy-pasting it into the games, effectively spoiling the origin story of the Mimic 2 years before the Origins game comes out, I'm totally open to that happening. Does this mean that I believe 100% of what happens in the books also happens in the games? Not yet. There's still some questions that I need answered. For example, if Mexes was made in the early 80s specifically to keep the Mimic trapped under the FNAF 6 pizzeria, and Gregory says the Mimic has been trapped down there for, quote, a really long time, that doesn't really line up with what happens in the books. In the books, the Mimic is shipped to the Pizzaplex while the mall is still being built, and then is trapped in the FNAF 6 pizzeria. So unless the Mimic was trapped under the FNAF 6 pizzeria in the 80s, escaped, and then got re-trapped, we have some problems. And hopefully we'll find out all of those answers in Secret of the Mimic coming out next year. I hope you enjoyed the
It is possible that the Mimic was brought to that place specifically because the program to stop it was actually there. I think that's very interesting, and an interesting idea. I think there's some other things. Notice that Glitchtrap wasn't mentioned once in this video. I don't think Glitchtrap is gone. I don't think Glitchtrap is necessarily removed from the story. Because quite frankly, I don't think it makes sense. First of all, Scott said we're getting Vanny back at some point. I don't know if that's in reference to like the FNAF movie too, or I think it is like a game appearance. So, like another try at her character. So I am expecting, right, hoping that comes to fruition, and I don't think it's happening in this game. Also, Scott said there's another game coming, right? I think that the Mimic is not the actual villain. Scott did call him a villain. He is an antagonist. I think there's actually going to be a redemption arc for the Mimic for a lot of reasons, and those reasons boil down to the books. The books, the way they phrase, the way that they shape the character of the Mimic. The Mimic is a mindless, violent creature who is infused with agony, with Edwin's grief, murderous rage whenever he actually destroyed him. And there is a way of actually, destroying agony that we see in Fazbear Frights, in Tales of the Pizzaplex. But I think there's actually a way that the Mimic could actually be the answer to finishing the story. Because I think that, and I don't think it's going to be in the way people expect. Like, I don't think we're going against the Mimic. I think the Mimic is going to be on our side. There's a lot of reasons for that. I don't have time to explain all of that. This was a good theory, though, because it actually went through a lot of the possibilities, presented a lot of alternatives, even if it didn't exactly align with the opinion of the author. I really appreciated this video. I think it was absolutely amazing. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please go subscribe to FNAF. Please give me your comments below what you guys thought. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.